The British Broadcasting Corporation is a British public service broadcaster. It is headquartered at Broadcasting House in London, and is the world's oldest national broadcasting organisation and the largest broadcaster in the world by number of employees, with over 20,950 staff in total, of whom 16,672 are in public sector broadcasting, including part-time, flexible as well as fixed contract staff. The total number is 35,402. The BBC is established under Royal Charter and operates under its agreement with the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. Its work is funded principally by an annual television licence fee which is charged to all British households, companies, and organisations using any type of equipment to receive or record live television broadcasts. The fee is set by the British government, agreed by Parliament, and used to fund the BBC's extensive radio, TV, and online services covering the nations and regions of the UK. For the 1st of April 2014, it also funds the BBC World Service, launched in 1932, which provides comprehensive TV, radio, and online services in Arabic and Persian, and broadcasts in 28 languages. Around a quarter of BBC revenues come from its commercial arm BBC Worldwide Limited, which sells BBC programmes and services internationally and also distributes the BBC's international 24-hour English-language news services BBC World News and BBC provided by BBC Global News Limited. History: Britain's first live public broadcast from the Marconi factory in Chelmsford took place in June 1920. It was sponsored by the Daily Mail's Lord Northcliffe and featured the famous Australian soprano Dame Nellie Melba. The Melba broadcast caught the people's imagination and marked a turning point in the British public's attitude to radio. However, this public enthusiasm was not shared in official circles, where such broadcasts were held to interfere with important military and civil communications. By late 1920, pressure from these quarters and uneasiness among the staff of the licensing authority, the General Post Office, was sufficient to lead to a ban on further Chelmsford broadcasts. But by 1922, the GPO had received nearly 100 broadcast license requests and moved to rescind its ban in the wake of a petition by 63 wireless societies with over 3,000 members. Anxious to avoid the same chaotic expansion experienced in the United States, the GPO proposed that it would issue a single broadcasting license to a company jointly owned by a consortium of leading wireless receiver manufacturers, to be known as the British Broadcasting Company Limited. John Reith, a Scottish Calvinist, was appointed its general manager in December 1922, a few weeks after the company made its first official broadcast. The company was to be financed by a royalty on the sale of BBC wireless receiving sets from approved manufacturers. The financial arrangement soon proved inadequate. Set sales were disappointing as amateurs made their own receivers and listeners bought rival unlicensed sets. By mid-1923, discussions between the GPO and the BBC had become deadlocked, and the Postmaster General commissioned a review of broadcasting by the Sykes Committee. The committee recommended a short-term reorganisation of licence fees with improved enforcement in order to address the BBC's immediate financial distress, and an increased share of the licence revenue split between it and the GPO. This was to be followed by a simple 10 shillings license fee with no royalty once the wireless manufacturer's protection expired. The BBC's broadcasting monopoly was made explicit for the duration of its current broadcast license, as was the prohibition on advertising. The BBC was also banned from presenting news bulletins before 1900 and required to source all news from external wire services. Mid-1925 found the future of broadcasting under further consideration, this time by the Crawford Committee. By now the BBC under Reith's leadership had forged a consensus favouring a continuation of the unified broadcasting service, but more money was still required to finance rapid expansion. Wireless manufacturers were anxious to exit the loss-making consortium with Reith keen that the BBC be seen as a public service rather than a commercial enterprise. The recommendations of the Crawford Committee were published in March the following year and were still under consideration by the GPO when the 1926 general strike broke out in May. The strike temporarily interrupted newspaper production, and with restrictions on news bulletins waived, the BBC suddenly became the primary source of news for the duration of the crisis. The crisis placed the BBC in a delicate position. On one hand, Reith was acutely aware that the government might exercise its right to commandeer the BBC at any time as a mouthpiece of the government, if the BBC were to step out of line. But on the other, he was anxious to maintain public trust by appearing to be acting independently. The government was divided on how to handle the BBC, but ended up trusting Reith, whose opposition to the strike mirrored the PM's own. Thus the BBC was granted sufficient leeway to pursue the government's objectives largely in a manner of its own choosing. The resulting coverage of both striker and government viewpoints impressed millions of listeners who were unaware that the PM had broadcast to the nation from Reith's home, using one of Reith's sound bites inserted at the last moment, or that the BBC had banned broadcasts from the Labour Party and delayed a peace appeal by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Supporters of the strike nicknamed the BBC the BFC for British Falsehood Company. Reith personally announced the end of the strike, which he marked by reciting from Blake's Jerusalem, signifying that England had been saved. The BBC did well out of the crisis, which cemented a national audience for its broadcasting and was followed by the government's official acceptance of the Crawford Committee recommendations transferring the operations of the company to a British Broadcasting Corporation established by royal charter. Reith was knighted on the 1st of January 1927, becoming the first Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation. While the BBC tends to characterise its coverage of the general strike by emphasising the positive impression created by its balanced coverage of the views of government and strikers, John Seaton, professor of media history and the official BBC historian, has characterised the episode as the invention of modern propaganda in its British form. Reith argued that trust gained by authentic impartial news could then be used. Impartial news was not necessarily an end in itself. To represent its purpose and values, the corporation adopted the coat of arms, including the motto, "Nation shall speak peace unto nation." British radio audiences had little choice apart from the upscale programming of the BBC. Reith, an intensely moralistic executive, was in full charge. His goal was to broadcast all that is best in every department of human knowledge, endeavour and achievement. The preservation of a high moral tone is obviously of paramount importance. Reith succeeded in building a high wall against an American-style free-for-all in radio, in which the goal was to attract the largest audiences and thereby secure the greatest advertising revenue. There was no paid advertising on the BBC. All the revenue came from a tax on receiving sets. Highbrow audiences, however, greatly enjoyed it, at a time when American, Australian and Canadian stations were drawing huge audiences cheering for their local teams with the broadcast of baseball, rugby and hockey. The BBC emphasized service for a national, rather than a regional audience. Boat races were well covered along with tennis and horse racing, but BBC was reluctant to spend its severely limited airtime on long football or cricket games, regardless of the popularity. BBC versus other media. The success of broadcasting provoked animosities between the BBC and well-established media such as theatres, concert halls and the recording industry. By 1929, the BBC complained that the agents of many comedians refused to sign contracts for broadcasting, because they feared it harmed the artist by making his material stale, and that it reduces the value of the artist as a visible music hall performer. On the other hand, the BBC was keenly interested in a cooperation with the recording companies who, in recent years, have not been slow to make records of singers, orchestras, dance bands, etc., who have already proved the power to achieve popularity by wireless. Radio plays were so popular that the BBC had received 6,000 manuscripts by 1929, most of them written for stage and of little value for broadcasting. Day in and day out, manuscripts come in, and nearly all go out again through the post, with a note saying, "We regret," etc. Single quote. In the 1930s, music broadcasts also enjoyed great popularity. For example, the friendly and wide-ranging organ broadcasts at St George's Hall, Langham Place by Reginald Fort, who held the official role of BBC staff theatre organist from 1936 to 1938. Fort continued to work for the BBC as a freelance into the 1940s and enjoyed nationwide following. Experimental television broadcasts were started in 1932, using an electromechanical 30-line system developed by John Logie Baird. Limited regular broadcasts using this system began in 1934, and an expanded service started from Alexandra Palace in 1936, alternating between an improved Baird mechanical 240-line system and the all-electronic 405-line Marconi EMI system. The superiority of the electronic systems or the mechanical system dropped early the following year. Television broadcasting was suspended from the 1st of September 1939 to the 7th of June 1946 during the Second World War, and it was left to BBC radio broadcasters such as Reginald Fort to keep the nation's spirits up. The BBC moved much of its radio operations out of London, initially to Bristol and then to Bedford. Concerts were broadcast from the Corn Exchange, the Trinity Chapel in St Paul's Church. Bedford was the studio for the daily service from 1941 to 1945 and, in the darkest days of the war in 1941, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York came to St Paul's to broadcast to the UK and all parts of the world on the National Day of Prayer. There was a widely reported urban myth that, upon resumption of the BBC television service after the war, announcer Leslie Mitchell started by saying, "As I was saying before, we were so rudely interrupted." In fact, the first person to appear when transmission resumed was Jasmine Bligh, and the words said were, "Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bligh?" The European Broadcasting Union was formed on 12 February 1950 in Turkey, with the BBC among the 23 founding broadcasting organizations. Competition to the BBC was introduced in 1955 with the commercial and independently operated television network of ITV. However, the BBC monopoly on radio services would persist until 8 October 1973, when, under the control of a newly renamed Independent Broadcasting Authority, the UK's first independent local radio station, LBC, came on air in the London area. As a result of the Pilkington Committee report of 1962, in which the BBC was praised for the quality and range of its output, and ITV was very heavily criticised for not providing enough quality programming, the decision was taken to award the BBC a second television channel, BBC Two, in 1964, renaming the existing service BBC One. BBC Two used the higher resolution 625-line standard, which had been standardized across Europe. BBC Two was broadcast in colour from 1 July 1967, and was joined by BBC One and ITV on 15 November 1969. The 405-line VHF transmissions of BBC One were continued for compatibility with older television receivers until 1985. Starting in 1964, a series of pirate radio stations came on the air and forced the British government finally to regulate radio services to permit nationally based advertising finance services. In response, the BBC reorganised and renamed the radio channels. On 30 September 1967, the Light programme was split into Radio 1 offering continuous popular music and Radio 2 more easy listening. The third programme became Radio 3 offering classical music and cultural programming. The home service became Radio 4 offering news and non-musical content such as quiz shows, readings, dramas and plays, as well as the 4 national channels. A series of local BBC radio stations were established in 1967, including Radio London. In 1969, the BBC Enterprises Department was formed to exploit BBC brands and programmes for commercial spin-off products. In 1979, it became a wholly owned limited company, BBC Enterprises Limited. In 1974, the BBC's teletext service, CFAX, was introduced, created initially to provide subtitling, but developed into a news and information service. In 1978, BBC staff went on strike just before the Christmas of that year, thus blocking out the transmission of both channels and amalgamating all 4 radio stations into one. Since the deregulation of the UK television and radio market in the 1980s, the BBC has faced increased competition from the commercial sector, especially on satellite television, cable television, and digital television services. In the late 1980s, the BBC began a process of divestment by spinning off and selling parts of its organisation. In 1988, it sold off the Hulton Press Library, a photographic archive which had been acquired from the Picture Post magazine by the BBC in 1957. The archive was sold to Brian Deutsch and is now owned by Getty Images. During the 1990s, this process continued with the separation of certain operational arms of the corporation into autonomous but wholly owned subsidiaries of the BBC, with the aim of generating additional revenue for programme making. BBC Enterprises was reorganised and relaunched in 1995 as BBC Worldwide Limited. In 1998, BBC Studios, outside broadcasts, post-production, design, costumes and wigs were spun off into BBC Resources Limited. The BBC Research Department has played a major part in the development of broadcasting and recording techniques. In the early days, it carried out essential research into acoustics and program level and noise measurement. The BBC was also responsible for the development of the NICAM stereo standard. In recent decades, a number of additional channels and radio stations have been launched. Radio 5 was launched in 1990 as a sports and educational station, but was replaced in 1994 with Radio 5 Live. Following the success of the Radio 4 service to cover the 1991 Gulf War, the new station would be a news and sports station. In 1997, BBC News 24, a rolling news channel, launched on digital television services in the following year. BBC Choice launched as the third general entertainment channel from the BBC. The BBC also purchased the Parliamentary Channel, which was renamed BBC Parliament. In 1999, BBC Knowledge launched as a multimedia channel, with services available on the newly launched BBC Text digital teletext service, and on BBC Online. The channel had an educational aim, which was modified later on in its life to offer documentaries. In 2002, several television and radio channels were reorganized. BBC Knowledge was replaced by BBC4 and became the BBC's Arts and Documentaries channel. CBBC, which had been a programming strand as Children's BBC since 1985, was split into CBBC and CBeebies for younger children, with both new services getting a digital channel, the CBBC channel and CBeebies channel. In addition to the television channels, new digital radio stations were created: 1 Extra, 6 Music and BBC 7. BBC 1 Extra was a sister station to Radio 1 and specialised in modern black music. BBC 6 Music specialised in alternative music genres, and BBC 7 specialised in archive, speech and children's programming. The following few years resulted in repositioning of some of the channels to conform to a larger brand. In 2003, BBC Choice was replaced by BBC 3, with programming for younger generations and shocking real-life documentaries. BBC News 24 became the BBC News Channel in 2008, and BBC Radio 7 became BBC Radio 4 Extra in 2011, with new programs to supplement those broadcast on Radio 4. In 2008, another channel was launched, BBC Alba, a Scottish Gaelic service. During this decade, the corporation began to sell off a number of its operational divisions to private owners. BBC Broadcast was spun off as a separate company in 2002, and in 2005. It was sold off to Australian-based Macquarie Capital Alliance Group and Macquarie Bank Limited and rebranded Red Bee Media. The BBC's IT, telephony and broadcast technology were brought together as BBC Technology Limited in 2001, and a division was later sold to the German engineering and electronics company Siemens IT Solutions and Services. SIS was subsequently acquired from Siemens by the French company Atos. Further divestments in this decade included BBC Books, BBC Outside Broadcasts Limited, Costumes and Wigs, and BBC Magazines. After the sales of OBs and Costumes, the remainder of BBC Resources was reorganized as BBC Studios and Post-Production, which continues today as a wholly owned subsidiary of the BBC. The 2004 Hutton inquiry and the subsequent report raised questions about the BBC's journalistic standards and its impartiality. This led to resignations of senior management members at the time, including the then Director General, Greg Dyke. In January 2007, the BBC released minutes of the board meeting which led to Greg Dyke's resignation. Unlike the other departments of the BBC World Service was funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office, more commonly known as the Foreign Office or the FCO, is the British government department responsible for promoting the interests of the United Kingdom abroad. In the past few years, the BBC has experimented in high-definition television. In 2006, BBC HD launched as an experimental service, and became official in December 2007. The channel broadcasts HD simulcasts of programs on BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Three and BBC Four, as well as repeats of some older programs in HD. In 2010, a HD simulcast of BBC One launched, BBC One HD. The new channel uses HD versions of BBC One's schedule and uses upscaled versions of programs not currently produced in HD. On the 18th of October 2007, BBC Director General Mark Thompson announced a controversial plan to make major cuts and reduce the size of the BBC as an organisation. The plans included a reduction in posts of 2,500, including 1,800 redundancies, consolidating news operations, reducing programming output by 10% and selling off the flagship television centre building in London. These plans have been fiercely opposed by unions, who have threatened a series of strikes. However, the BBC have stated that the cuts are essential to move the organisation forward and concentrate on increasing the quality of programming. On the 20th of October 2010, the Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne announced that the television licence fee would be frozen at its current level until the end of the current charter in 2016. The same announcement revealed that the BBC would take on the full cost of running the BBC World Service and a BBC monitoring service from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and partially finance the Welsh broadcaster S4C. 2011 to present further cuts were announced on the 6th of October 2011, so the BBC could reach a total reduction in the budget of 20%, following the licence fee freeze in October 2010, which included cutting staff by 2,000 and sending a further 1,000 to the Media City UK development in Salford, with BBC Three moving online only in 2016. The sharing of more programs between stations and channels, sharing of radio news bulletins, more repeats in schedules, including the whole of BBC Two daytime, and for some original programming to be reduced. BBC HD was closed on the 26th of March 2013 and replaced with an HD simulcast of BBC Two. However, flagship programs, other channels and full funding for CBBC in CBeebies would be retained. Numerous BBC facilities have been sold off, including New Broadcasting House on Oxford Road in Manchester. Many major departments have been relocated to Broadcasting House and Media City UK, particularly since the closure of BBC Television Centre in March 2013. The cuts inspired campaigns, petitions and protests such as Save BBC Three and Save Your BBC, which have built a following of hundreds of thousands of individuals concerned about the changes.